Behind the palace's polished smiles and gilded halls, a storm brews in silence. King Charles's fragile health has become the center of whispers, not just among doctors, but within his very family. And while Camilla's hand hovers dangerously close to the king's decisions, Prince William's quiet defiance transforms into a thunderous stand. But why did this battle erupt now, and what was at stake for the throne itself? In the grand halls of power, where every decision carries weight far beyond the individual, the matter of a king's health is never simply private. Charles had entered a delicate stage in his reign, his strength no longer the unshakable force it once was. Doctors were summoned in the dead of night, their briefings delivered in carefully guarded meetings that excluded all but a chosen few. What should have been a matter of medical advice soon turned into a battleground for influence, with Camilla at its center. She positioned herself as the gatekeeper, the interpreter of Charles's condition, and, in many cases, the voice that reached his ear before anyone else's. But this subtle control began to cast a shadow that no amount of royal charm could disguise. For William, it was a tormenting sight. To see his father weakened was one pain, but to see Camilla's hand shaping the very decisions that determined his future was another. The heir to the throne, once accustomed to deference, now found himself edged out of critical discussions. His questions about treatments were met with evasive answers, his attempts to sit with physicians intercepted by the queen consort's sudden interventions. It was as though a wall had been built between him and his father's truth, and behind that wall, Camilla held the keys. The palace staff felt the tremors of this growing power struggle. Courtiers, ever skilled at reading the shifting winds, whispered cautiously. Some believed Camilla's involvement was natural after all. She was the king's wife. Others, however, sensed an overreach that unsettled the very balance of the monarchy. Nurses and aides who confided too freely found themselves reassigned. Briefing papers were amended, signatures delayed, schedules rearranged. Bit by bit, the machinery of influence bent toward her command. The staff, caught in this silent tug-of-war, began to ask themselves where their loyalty truly lay with the king, or with the woman who spoke in his name. It was in this tense environment that William's resistance began to harden. At first, it was a subtle raised eyebrow during a meeting, a carefully placed question that contradicted Camilla's statements, a private word with a doctor once the queen consort had left the room. He tested the boundaries, probing for truth, watching for cracks in the carefully managed narrative. Each time, he grew more convinced that his father was not hearing the full scope of his medical reality, and each time the weight on his shoulders grew heavier. He was not only the king's son, he was the heir, and the heir could not afford silence when the future of the monarchy was at risk. Tension mounted with every passing day, each silent exchange between William and Camilla thick with unspoken conflict. Courtiers noticed the glances, the pauses that lingered too long, the frost in conversations that once flowed with polite civility. A confrontation seemed inevitable, and yet no one dared predict how or when it would come. For within the palace, silence is often more dangerous than speech, and this silence was deafening. But this was only the beginning, because William's silent resistance would soon explode into a moment that left courtiers whispering one word: "Bravo!" For years, Camilla's rise has been shadowed by controversy. Yet inside the palace walls, her influence over Charles's decisions has grown stronger than ever. Now, with the king's health at stake, whispers claim her ambitions were no longer about titles or crowns, but about control over the very treatments that determined his survival. It began quietly, almost invisibly. Each medical briefing that should have flowed directly from physician to monarch suddenly passed through Camilla's hands. She presented information in her own way, framing details in a tone that softened some realities while sharpening others. What was meant to be a private matter of diagnosis and care quickly became a carefully managed narrative, one that placed her not at Charles's side, but at the center of his medical world. Advisors noticed the shift but dared not object. She had turned herself into the interpreter of the king's health, and few inside the palace had the courage to question the filter through which truth now traveled. The whispers grew darker when allegations surfaced that Camilla's preferences leaned not toward the king's recovery, but toward the monarchy's appearance. Some insiders claimed she urged doctors to delay more invasive treatments that might keep Charles out of the public eye too long, arguing instead for solutions that preserved his ability to be seen smiling, waving, standing tall before cameras. The welfare of the sovereign, it seemed, was being weighed against the optics of his reign. And while the public cheered his appearances, insiders watched with unease, wondering if those appearances came at too high a cost. William and Anne, both known for their protective instincts toward their father, soon felt the cold edge of exclusion. Discussions once open to the family were quietly narrowed. Invitations to briefings mysteriously lost. Doors closed with explanations of limited attendance. Their absence from the decision-making table was not accidental. It was orchestrated. By the time they learned of medical updates, choices had already been made. Camilla had positioned herself as the guardian of access, and even the king's children found themselves left outside the gates. What made this grip even more effective was Charles's own vulnerability. Illness weakens not only the body, but also the spirit. Tired, worn, and increasingly weary of the endless noise of royal responsibility, Charles leaned on Camilla more than ever before. Her presence was constant, her voice persuasive, her loyalty assured in his eyes. For a man burdened by both duty and disease, trusting the partner closest to him was natural. Yet this very trust deepened her hold, making him dependent on her counsel in ways he had never been on anyone else. Meanwhile, the public remained largely oblivious. To them, the king was carrying on. The queen consort faithfully by his side, a picture of stability in a time of uncertainty. But behind the palace gates, staff exchanged nervous glances and muttered warnings. They knew that what looked like harmony on the balcony masked a dangerous imbalance behind closed doors. The entire ordeal mirrored older battles that history had nearly buried, moments when consorts of the past, consumed by ambition, overstepped boundaries and reshaped the course of royal destiny. To those who remembered, it felt hauntingly familiar, as if history itself was rising again to repeat its cycle of overreach and defiance. But William was not, about to let history repeat itself, and what happened next would shift the balance of power inside Buckingham Palace forever. There comes a moment when silence becomes betrayal. For William, watching Camilla overshadow doctors, dictate decisions, and edge him out of his father's care was the final straw. His love as a son collided with his duty as heir. The confrontation could no longer be avoided. The signs had been mounting for weeks, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore as time wore on. William noticed small but critical discrepancies in the health reports he received about his father. Numbers that didn't add up. Treatments mentioned in one meeting but mysteriously absent in the next. Each inconsistency pointed to the same chilling possibility. The information reaching him was not the whole truth. And when he pressed doctors for clarity, their answers were halting, hesitant, as though someone else had framed the narrative before it ever reached him. That someone, he suspected, was Camilla. It was not difficult to imagine. She had made herself the constant presence in Charles's medical orbit, speaking for him when he was too tired, correcting the doctors mid-sentence, and framing updates in ways that left little room for questions. William began to sense that critical advice, possibly even warnings, was being filtered, softened, or delayed until it no longer carried its original urgency. The realization hit him with the weight of betrayal, not just against him as son and heir, but against the king, whose well-being was meant to come before politics or power. Late at night, when the palace halls grew silent, William gathered with Anne, Catherine, and a handful of trusted aides. These meetings were not formal councils, but emotional gatherings, driven by frustration and desperation. Anne, sharp and unflinching, voiced her own suspicions, noting how often she too had been shut out. Catherine, ever protective, reminded William of the human cost, that this was not only about monarchy, but about a father who deserved honesty and dignity in his care. Together, they pieced together what little they could, drawing lines between omissions and whispers, until the picture was clear. Camilla's influence was not accidental. It was deliberate, and it was tightening. For William, the conflict tore at him daily. He was not only a son grieving the sight of his father's decline, but also a prince burdened with the responsibility of succession. To remain silent was to allow the crown itself to be shaped by manipulation. Yet to act meant risking open war with Camilla, the woman who now stood as both queen consort and gatekeeper to the king. Compassion clashed with confrontation, and love with duty, until he could no longer separate them. The breaking point came after a private moment with Charles. In one of their rare conversations without Camilla hovering near, William caught a glimpse of his father's frailty. The king spoke softly, hinting at his exhaustion, admitting without words that he was overwhelmed. That quiet exchange seared into William's mind, not just as a son's heartbreak, but as a command unspoken. He walked away, resolved, no longer wavering. The vow he carried out of that room was simple, but absolute. no more interference. It was a promise to himself, to his father, and to the crown. From that moment forward, he knew there could be no turning back. And so, in a single explosive meeting, William would do the unthinkable, stand between Camilla and the king's future. It was supposed to be just another palace medical briefing, but what unfolded became legend. With doctors present, Charles seated in silence, and Camilla poised to give her opinion, William stepped forward. What followed was not a son speaking, but an heir to the throne drawing a line in the sand. The atmosphere in the king's private chamber was suffocating, thick with a silence that carried more weight than any words. The physicians shuffled their papers nervously, their eyes darting between the queen consort and the heir apparent. Camilla had positioned herself, as always, at the forefront, ready to voice her preference for a particular medical path. She leaned into the moment with the confidence of someone who had grown accustomed to being obeyed. In her mind, this was her role: protector, advisor, decision-maker. But she underestimated the resolve that had been building in William for weeks. As Camilla began to speak, outlining her favored course of action, William interrupted, his tone measured but firm. It was not anger that filled the room, but an unmistakable authority. The words cut through the chamber like a blade, silencing even the rustle of paper. For the first time, William confronted the influence that had hung like a shadow over his father's care. His voice carried not just the weight of filial love, but the unmistakable force of royal duty. Those present would later recall the moment as one that shifted the balance of power in a single breath. The doctors, caught in the crossfire, were visibly stunned. Accustomed to filtering their words through Camilla, they now faced the unflinching gaze of the future king. William demanded clarity, raw, unvarnished truth. He insisted that their counsel be given directly, unedited, and independent of any interference. It was a challenge not only to Camilla's presence, but to the culture of silence that had allowed her to command the space for so long. His questions came sharp and pointed, stripping away the polite veil that had concealed the manipulation of his father's health narrative. Charles himself sat quietly, torn between two worlds. His eyes shifted between his wife and his son, his expression betraying the pain of a man pulled in opposite directions. To the outside observer, it seemed almost unbearable. A monarch caught between loyalty to the woman who had stood beside him through storms of scandal and the son who embodied the very future of the crown. His silence was not indifference, it was torment. Yet in that silence, William found the strength to speak what Charles could not. And then came the line, the one that insiders would repeat in hushed tones long after the meeting ended. With respect, this is my father's health, not a matter of image or convenience. The words rang out with a finality that no one dared challenge. It was both a rebuke and a declaration, one that placed William squarely in the role of protector, even if it meant defying the queen consort herself. The chamber held its breath in the aftermath. Camilla's face betrayed nothing, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. William had crossed a threshold from which there could be no retreat. The doctors, emboldened by his intervention, began to answer his questions directly, their relief palpable as they finally spoke without fear of contradiction. In that instant, the hierarchy of the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. But the battle didn't end in that room. It spilled into the very heart of the monarchy, exposing divisions no one could ignore. The confrontation spread through the palace like wildfire. Staffers whispered in corridors, aides exchanged frantic notes, and senior royals braced for fallout. William's stand had sent shockwaves, but it also forced the monarchy to confront a terrifying question. Who really speaks for the king? Almost overnight, the palace became divided. Some insiders hailed William's defiance as necessary, even overdue. They saw in him a son unwilling to let his father's life be dictated by political optics or personal ambition. Others, however, clung to Camilla's authority, arguing that her position as queen consort entitled her to shape the king's care. What had been an unspoken tension for months was now a visible fracture, splitting loyalties along dangerous lines. Princess Anne quietly but firmly positioned herself on William's side. Her reputation as the most steadfast and unflinching royal lent credibility to his intervention. She did not shout, she did not grandstand, but her subtle nods, her quiet affirmations behind closed doors, gave William the reinforcement he needed. Those who doubted his boldness began to reconsider when they realized Anne was in his corner. It was as though the siblings had silently formed an alliance, an axis of truth against Camilla's tightening grip. Meanwhile, the courtiers faced their own nightmare. They scrambled to control the narrative, knowing full well that whispers rarely stayed inside palace walls for long. Papers were shuffled, memos were redrafted, and strategies devised to prevent the story from slipping into the press. But leaks are as old as the monarchy itself, and already rumors trickled out fragments of sentences, half-truths, and speculative reports painting a picture of a house divided. Each effort to suppress the story only fueled suspicion, each denial raising new questions. Charles, the man at the center of this storm, retreated deeper into silence. His refusal to speak publicly about the confrontation only heightened speculation. Was he grateful for William's intervention, or resentful of his son's audacity? Did he side with his wife's authority, or his heir's determination? His silence was interpreted 1,000 different ways, each one feeding the fire rather than extinguishing it. In his silence, the monarchy's most dangerous vulnerability was exposed. The king's voice was no longer the loudest in the palace. Even the medical staff felt the tremors. Their duty was to the sovereign, yet they found themselves uncomfortably entangled in palace politics. Doctors and nurses spoke in hushed tones, worried that their advice might be twisted, their reputations tarnished, or their words weaponized. It was an unbearable tension for those whose work should have been clinical, not political. But perhaps the most significant shift came not in words or whispers, but in perception. Behind closed doors, William began to emerge as a new force in decision-making. He was no longer the watchful son waiting on the sidelines. He was the heir who had taken control, the protector who dared to challenge the queen consort in her own domain. Every action he took now carried weight. Every word echoed with new authority. And though the palace might have feared the fracture, it could no longer deny the transformation. And yet, while the palace struggled to contain the storm, the public was about to catch wind of something that couldn't be hidden. When whispers leak, the world listens. Suddenly, tabloids and broadcasters buzzed with rumors. Had William defied Camilla? The public, long suspicious of palace tensions, now had a story that ignited fierce debate and drew overwhelming sympathy for William. Headlines erupted like fire across front pages. William stands firm. The heir versus the queen. A battle over the king's health. What had begun as private confrontation within hushed palace chambers now spilled into the open, where the court of public opinion would decide its weight. Journalists dissected every rumor, columnists speculated on what this meant for the monarchy, and broadcasters filled hours of air with speculation. The notion that William had stepped in, not for power, but for his father's well-being, painted him as the dutiful son, the protective heir the people had long admired. On the streets, in cafes, and in online forums, voices rallied behind him. To many, William embodied the values they wanted in their future king: honesty, courage, and an unwillingness to bow to palace politics when the life of his father was at stake. Polls surged in his favor, with overwhelming numbers siding with his actions, praising his stand as both noble and necessary. Ordinary people spoke of their own struggles with family loyalty. How William's defiance reminded them that even within the monarchy, love for a parent could eclipse protocol. But the same voices that praised William condemned Camilla. Narratives cast her as power-hungry, more concerned with appearances than the king's well-being. Commentators accused her of meddling in matters beyond her place, with words like manipulation and control repeated so often they began to shape her public image anew. It was not just a question of influence, it was a question of legitimacy. For every headline that celebrated William, there was another that scrutinized Camilla's role, leaving her standing weaker than it had been in years. Inside the palace, panic ensued. The monarchy's PR machine scrambled to regain control of the story. Carefully worded statements were drafted, emphasizing unity and denying division, but the public was no longer convinced. Every attempt to suppress the narrative only fueled suspicion. Social media thrived on leaks and speculation, amplifying the very whispers the palace had hoped to silence. The divide between what the public believed and what the monarchy projected grew sharper by the day. This created a dangerous paradox. Within the family, loyalties were still fragile, but outside, William was being elevated to near-heroic status. The world saw him as the voice of reason, while Camilla's reputation unraveled. Private loyalty was fractured, yet public perception was crystal clear. William had chosen compassion over convenience, and in doing so, revealed a side of himself that resonated deeply with millions. But for William, this was never about headlines. It was about something deeper: the bond between father and son, and the cost of protecting it. Charles may have been silent during the confrontation, but silence does not mean absence. Days later, in a rare private moment, the king gave William a glance, a sigh, and words that carried both pain and gratitude. It was a father's acknowledgement that his son had done what he could not. When William entered his father's private quarters, the atmosphere was markedly different from the charged chamber where the clash had erupted. Here there was no audience, no courtiers waiting with bated breath, no Camilla ready to interject. Just father and son, bound not by titles or duty in that moment, but by the fragile reality of illness and love. William sat close, searching his father's face, knowing that behind the measured composure of a monarch lay the exhaustion of a man. Charles looked up slowly, his eyes reflecting the burden of carrying a crown that had never felt heavier. In hushed tones, Charles admitted the pressure that had been suffocating him. He spoke not in speeches, but in fragments, as though the weight of the crown had eroded his strength to form full confessions. He spoke of the relentless pull from every side, doctors urging caution, Camilla pressing her counsel, courtiers warning of optics, and William demanding truth. It was not anger that he expressed, but a quiet desperation. A monarch bound by duty, a husband reliant on his consort, and a father torn by the loyalty of a son who refused to let silence take root. The emotional toll of battling illness while reigning over a kingdom could not be hidden in this intimate exchange. William could see it etched in his father's hands, carved into his posture, lingering in the pauses between words. Charles confessed that the crown, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a chain. He struggled not only against his own body, but against the suffocating expectations of those who demanded he remain the unyielding figure the nation relied on. It was an impossible burden, one that no crown could soften. And yet, beneath this heaviness, a rare tenderness flickered. Charles reached out not as king to heir, but as father to son. He did not need to say much. His eyes alone carried the message. William's intervention had shaken him, but it had also lifted him. For once, someone had spoken not out of ambition or appearances, but out of love so fierce it dared to defy royal protocol. Subtly, Charles gave his son the affirmation he had craved, but never sought openly. He acknowledged William's courage, recognizing the risk he had taken in standing against Camilla's influence. It was not a grand declaration, nor a dramatic speech, but something far more powerful, a silent passing of trust. At that moment, William was no longer only the heir to the throne. He had become his father's protector, the guardian who would shield him even when he could not shield himself. But if Charles's quiet approval gave William strength, Camilla's simmering fury promised the war was far from over. Camilla was not one to be sidelined. To be stopped in front of doctors, staff, and her own husband was humiliation, but also a warning. And as history has shown, palace rivalries never end with a single battle. The sting of William's defiance lingered like a wound. Camilla had grown accustomed to commanding rooms, to shaping outcomes through persistence and persuasion. Yet in one decisive moment, William had stripped her of control, asserting himself as both son and heir in a way she had not anticipated. That humiliation burned deeply, and within the silence of her private chambers, it transformed into something darker: determination. She would not allow herself to be outmaneuvered again. Her moves were not loud or obvious. Instead, she worked quietly, weaving influence through the trusted advisors and allies who had long been part of her circle. Messages were delivered, private meetings arranged, and narratives seeded with care. In these spaces, she began to reframe the confrontation not as William's act of protection, but as his act of disrespect. She painted him as rash, impulsive, and dangerously willing to undermine the queen consort before the very people sworn to serve the king. To those who owed her loyalty, she suggested that William's stand was not courage but arrogance, a power grab masked as filial devotion. The tensions grew heavier with each whisper. Where William's influence expanded, so too did Camilla's resentment. Staffers found themselves caught in the middle, forced to choose their allegiance carefully. Some gravitated toward the certainty of William's leadership, drawn by his clear resolve to protect the king. Others, fearing Camilla's sharp memory and enduring reach, clung to her side, unwilling to risk her disfavor. It became a palace divided not by walls, but by loyalties, each corridor carrying an unspoken question: who truly held power now? Anne and Catherine, wise enough to see the storm forming, prepared themselves for what was to come. They knew Camilla's nature well enough to understand that her silence was temporary. Catherine urged William to hold firm, but to tread carefully, knowing that Camilla's countermoves could be devastating if left unchecked. Anne, ever the strategist, warned that this was no isolated quarrel, but the beginning of a long war for influence. They stood beside William, not only as family, but as his fortress, knowing that his strength would need to be matched by theirs if the monarchy was to endure the trials ahead. And so, the palace braced itself. William's intervention had shifted the balance, but it had also set the stage for further conflict. Camilla would not forget. She would not forgive. Her countermoves were already in motion, designed to claw back what she had lost, and to remind those who doubted her that her influence had not faded, but evolved. The first battle had ended, but the war had only just begun. And yet, through it all, one truth remained unshaken: the people's cry that still echoed within the palace walls. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.